Be live. Am I ready?
You want to do Facebook Live?
Hello and welcome one and all. Thank you so much for being here with us on this beautiful Jackson Hole evening for this fantastic lecture and presentation.
Hello.
We're grateful to have. Does everyone hear me?
Rabbi, I can't hear what you're saying.
I can hear you just fine, Zalman. And I can hear the person who said he can't hear Zalman as well.
So chat him.
Lift up your finger if you can hear me.
I can't hear.
Oh, that's the lawn.
Check your sound, Elon. We'll send you a message. Please message Elon regarding the sound.
Tell him to sign in and sign back in. Restart his computer.
Okay, can I log in onto your computer?
Are we all ready? Are we good to go? Can I get a thumbs up? Are we good to go? Okay, thank you all so very much for being here with us on this beautiful evening here in Jackson Hole. It is my esteemed and great pleasure to welcome our very special guest, a world-class economist and the host of the popular Econ Talk podcast, which I have had on occasion the opportunity and the pleasure of listening to. My name is Rabbi Zalman Mendelson, and it is wonderful to have Russ Roberts here with us on this special evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging the many faces that I'm familiar with over here that are with us on this call, as well as the many people who are here with us for the very first time. It is a pleasure to see each and every one of you. I'd like to first and foremost thank our very dear friend Elon Wood for allowing and enabling this event to be possible. Thank you very much. Tonight, as we gather here for this special talk, I'd like to talk about for just a brief moment one of the unique things that has happened historically in these days between the holiday of Passover and Shavuot. Many of you are familiar with the deep, wonderful words of Rabbi Akiva, the great sage who taught us that we have to recognize the importance of loving one's fellow as much as you love oneself. This is the key message of the entire Torah. In fact, during this time of year, 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva passed away, and the Talmud tells us what was the spiritual reasoning for this plague, what was the underlying principle for why they died, because they didn't have respect for one another. How has it come to be that the students of Rabbi Akiva, whose main teaching was to love your fellow as yourself, couldn't have respect for one another? But it just goes to show how important it is that we recall and remember, even with the great teachers that we have around with us to teach us and inspire us. Now more than ever, it is vitally important that we recognize that there's beauty in diversity. Diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, diversity of looks, diversity of energy, of inspiration. And we must, at all costs, recognize that we must respect one another. Otherwise, a plague, not the plague of coronavirus, not the plague of Rabbi Akiva's students, but the plague of lack of commonality and connection and respect is what ultimately will consume us. I'd like to just share briefly some brief remarks with regards to the schedule this evening. First of all, we will begin with a 30-minute presentation or an opening presentation from Professor Russ Roberts, and then we will move along to Q&A. Please type in your questions in the chat box. So during the Q&A, our moderator, Elon Wood, will be able to answer and ask your questions of Professor Roberts. I'd like to inform you about several upcoming events that we will be having this upcoming Thursday. We are privileged to be able to be hosting Dr. Sherman Silber for a fascinating presentation on the subject of infertility crisis. I hope you can join us for that important discussion. Following that, we will have a great opportunity to be able to host Dr. Olivier Harari, who will talk to us about the state of therapeutics and the relationship between plasma testing and the opportunities that might be available for us to be able to fight coronavirus. Finally, we have the great pleasure and honor of hosting our very own Avi Kantor for a discussion about how we can enhance and develop our personal character and our relationships during coronavirus, after coronavirus, so we can potentially better our personal lives and the lives of our loved ones. It is now my final remarks before we move along to Elon. Elon, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, can you hear me?
I hear you just fine. Before we move along to Elon's introduction of Professor Dr. Roberts, I'd like to just highlight the fact that many of you know that during this challenging period of time, many in our community are suffering, and many have reached out to us to ask for support to enable them to manage through this very challenging period of time. Please consider a one-time tax-deductible donation to the Chabad Jewish Center of Wyoming, which can be done at jewishwyoming.com/donate. You're welcome to take a moment to do it now while we're on this call to enable us to support our community during this challenging period with dignity. It is now my great pleasure to invite our dear friend Elon Wood to be able to begin the conversation with Professor Roberts. Elon, take it away.
All right. Hello, Professor Roberts. Thank you for joining us in our community tonight. It's a great honor to have you, and I've loved your work for the last half a decade. So now I introduce to you our community, Professor Roberts. So Russ Roberts is the John and Jean Denault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He hosts the weekly podcast, Econ Talk, which he started in 2006. These are hour-long conversations with interesting speakers. Past guests include Jill Lepore, Milton Friedman, Martha Nussbaum, Thomas Piketty, Angela Duckworth, Sebastian Junger, Christopher Hitchens, Bill James, Nassim Taleb, and AJ Jacobs. Over 725 episodes are available at no charge at econtalk.org, iTunes, and places where people like to listen to podcasts. His 2 rap videos on the idea of John Maynard Keynes and F.A. Hayek, created with filmmaker John Papola, have had more than 11 million views on YouTube. They've been subtitled in 11 languages and are used in high schools and colleges, classrooms around the world. His animated poem, quote, "It's a Wonderful Loaf," something I've heard, and it's very good, is an ode to the emergent order of our everyday lives. His video series, The Numbers Game, looks at the challenges of measuring economic progress accurately. He is the author of 5 books, including 3 economic novels, along with, quote, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, An Unexpected Guide to Human Nature and Happiness, where Roberts takes the lessons from Adam Smith's little-known masterpiece, the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and applies them to modern life. So without further ado, I'm very happy that we have Professor Roberts with us, and please, Professor Roberts, get started.
Sec. I'm going to unmute. Okay, I'm unmuted. Can everybody hear me okay? Ray, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Yes? Yep, excellent. Okay.
Great.
Great, thank you. So I want to first thank Chabad of Wyoming, Rabbi Zalman and his family, and Elon Wood for setting this up. I want to express my gratitude to Chabad generally, which helped me find my path into Judaism, and wouldn't be here without them. And they do unbelievable work, I'm sure, in Jackson Hole. I'd love to find out personally, but I'm just seeing their kindness and enjoyed their kindness and incredible devotion all around the world. Incredible organization and wonderful people. Amazing thing that the Rebbe started, sending people out to talk to all of us. So I'm going to talk tonight, maybe about a half an hour, we'll see how it goes, about Judaism and Adam Smith. And on the surface, they don't have anything in common. It's kind of a strange combination. One of my sons, when I told him the topic of this talk is the Jewish side of Adam Smith, said, is there a Jewish side to Adam Smith? And I said, nope, there isn't. He said, it's going to be a short talk. But so there's really nothing other than the fact that Adam Smith, you know, is the same initials as Adam Sandler and same first name. There's not much that's literally Jewish about Adam Smith. But I'm going to suggest tonight that there's quite a bit of resonance and connection between Smith's ideas and a lot of Jewish thought. And for me, using a Jewish lens on Smith has enhanced my understanding of Smith. And at times, thinking about Smith has enhanced my thinking about Judaism. So first, a little background about Smith. He was born in 1723, small village in Scotland. His father dies a couple months before he's born. He's raised by his single mom, widowed mother. He never marries. He becomes a professor, teaches at a couple of different places. For a while, he's a tutor to a nobleman's son, and ends up at the end of his life as a customs inspector, which is a very strange thing for a man who believed in free trade as passionately as Smith did. His best friend was David Hume, and he wrote 2 books, and that's it. You know, he's kind of a failure, except for the fact that we're talking about him in 2020. You know, I think his mom's pretty proud of him, actually. So one of his books you may have heard of, it's an inquiry into the nature and causes of the Wealth of Nations. So The Wealth of Nations is his famous book. It's published in 1776. Most people think of it as the first book of economics. It's not, but it's the first book of economics that anybody still reads. And you can still read it with some value. You can find free versions online. And he's a wonderful writer. But I'm going to mostly talk tonight about his other book, the book that you probably haven't heard of, which is the book I wrote my book about. And that's a book he first wrote in 1759 and then later revised it 5 times during his life, published the last edition in the year of his death in 1790. So just to back up, Smith, 1723 to 1790, writes 2 books. One, 1776, very auspicious year for both America and economic thinking. And bookended around that famous book is this book that he also wrote before it, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that he writes in 1759 and revises all through his life, and finally revised it for the last time in 1790. So if I asked you, what does Adam Smith stand for? What are his views? What are his beliefs? Most people think of Smith as the great defender of greed, as the defender of free market, dog-eat-dog, laissez-faire capitalism. And one of the reasons I wrote the book that I wrote was that that's a really horrible caricature of what Smith, and dishonest view of what Smith was really about. So it turns out, if you read his other book, of course, he doesn't really defend greed in the Wealth of Nations either, but he gets treated as sort of this free market ideologue, which is, again, not particularly accurate. But if you read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, you'll find out that he was a big defender of morality, altruism, charity, and more interestingly, you'll learn that he thought that the desire to accumulate wealth and money and stuff was a horrible idea and destructive to the human enterprise and foolish. And many passages in The Theory of Moral Sentiments are consistent with the Musar movement, Jewish ethical movement of the 19th century, or the wisdom of Pirkei Avot, the opening of the Talmud. Many times Smith writes that it's futile to pursue wealth in hopes of having it make you happy. He says the key to happiness is tranquility, what we would call shalva in Hebrew. He says we think we'll be happy if we get a lot of money or fame, but he says that's really usually not the case, and we have the means to happiness at our hand. One of his most famous passages from The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is kind of shocking, is he talks about the poor man's son. So here's this kid who grows up, he's poor, his parents are poor, but he's ambitious. And he says when he begins to look around him, he admires the condition of the rich. He finds the cottage of his father too small for his accommodation and fancies he should be lodged more at his ease in a palace. Again, talking about the poor man's son, he is displeased with being obliged to walk afoot or to endure the fatigue of riding on horseback. He sees his superiors carried about on machines, meaning carriages, and imagines that in one of these he could travel with less inconveniency. He feels himself naturally indolent or lazy and willing to serve himself with his own hands as little as possible, and judges that a numerous retinue of servants would save him from a great deal of trouble. He thinks if he had attained all these, he would sit still contentedly and be quiet, enjoying himself in the thought of the happiness and tranquility of his situation. And he is enchanted with this distant idea. And he devotes himself forever to the pursuit of wealth and greatness. And then Smith describes what's going to happen to him. He serves those whom he hates. He's obsequious to those whom he despises. Through the whole of his life, he pursues the idea of a certain artificial and elegant repose, which he may never arrive at, for which he sacrifices a real tranquility that is at all times in his power. And he goes on to say, it's horrible. He talks about how he's going to die unhappy, etc. So it reminds me of the quote from the Talmud, who is rich? He was happy with his lot, says the Talmud. Smith would agree. Now, ironically, Smith sees a positive side. He talks about how corrosive the pursuit of wealth is, but he sees a positive side for this desire for wealth. And listen to what he says about it. And Rabbi Zalman, I think you'll know the Jewish version of this. Some of you others may as well. But here's what he says. This is Smith still. He says, this greed, this desire for stuff, he says, it's not going to make you happy. You're going to regret it when you get older. It's going to corrode your soul. You're going to be miserable, and you could have been happy without it. But he does have an upside. He says, it rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them, meaning human beings, to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life, which have entirely changed the whole face of the globe, have turned the rude forests of nature into agreeable and fertile plains, and made the trackless and barren ocean a new fund of subsistence, and the great high road of communication to the different nations of the earth. So, and it also then says, the earth by these labors of mankind has been obliged to redouble her natural fertility and maintain a greater multitude of inhabitants. So he's saying, this ambition that we have in our nature, it gets us to do all this stuff that isn't going to make us happy, but it does lead to some nice things on the side: art, science, civilization, etc. And it allows more people to live on the face of the earth, which is almost a perfect paraphrase of what it says in the Medrash. In Medrash Rabbah, it says, were it not for the evil inclination, no man would build a house, take a wife, have children, or do business. So he's similarly, in Jewish thought, this urge we have, which we call it the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, but it does have this positive side. And the Jewish view of this is very similar to Smith. At the end of Medrash Rabbah, in that passage, it quotes from Kohelet, from Ecclesiastes. Again, I considered all labor and all excelling at work, that is, a man's rivalry with his neighbor, it's a vanity and a striving after wind, after nothingness. So Kohelet, Smith's echoing Kohelet, of course, which came well before Smith. It doesn't really make you happy, this ambition and monetary desire, but it has some upsides, but mainly it's not really so good for your soul. So Smith doesn't just condemn the pursuit of wealth for its own sake. He's very interested in virtue. And he has some very nice insights into virtue and the challenge of being virtuous that I think reflects very, very thoughtfully on the challenges of being a good Jew. We'll see what you think here. So Smith talks about there are different kinds of virtues. There's justice. And he says, Smith says justice, and by justice, he means not hurting your neighbor, not stealing, not murdering, what we would call the lo ta'aseh, the negative commandments, the things we're not supposed to do that are wicked and harmful to others. He says those laws, the laws of justice, the things that we should do to not hurt other people, those laws are, he calls them precise, accurate, and indispensable. And I'll describe what he means by that in a second. He says the other kind of laws, they're loose, vague, and indeterminate. They're not so easy to specify. In particular, beneficence, how to be kind to others, how to improve the lot of others, how to make other people's lives better. How you do that is not so clear cut, unlike not stealing, which is clear cut. He makes a distinction between being a great writer and writing with great grammar. He says grammar is precise, accurate, indispensable. We all know what the rules of grammar are, but the rules of composition, how to be a great writer, loose, vague, and indeterminate. You can't specify them. There are no clear-cut rules. So he says, it reminded me, this idea of this contrast between conduct and behavior that is, and virtue that is loose, vague, and indeterminate versus conduct that is accurate, precise, and indispensable. Reminded me a lot of the commandments in Judaism that we struggle to keep. So for example, eating pork, it's pretty precise, right? It's not like something loose or vague or indeterminate about it. It's not like, well, if it's Tuesday night and it's after 11, maybe you can have pork. No pork, all right? Over, nothing, can't have it. Nobody, people might disagree about certain standards of kashrut, but once you have a certain standard, it's pretty black and white what it means to keep kosher. It's pretty black and white what it means to keep Shabbat. Those laws, they're precise, accurate, and indispensable. But there's a bunch of laws that aren't like that in Judaism. And if you think about them, they're the harder ones to keep. So last week's Parsha, which was Kedoshim, two of my favorites, God says, be holy because I am holy. How much time you spent worried about that? You know, there's not on the can of tuna, you get a nice hechsher. It says it's inspected by the Orthodox Union. Think, oh, I can have that. But is there anything in your life where you go, oh, that's not holy. There's no hechsher on it. No hechsher for holiness. Now you might have an idea of what's holy, what's not holy, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. Or how about this one? Also in last week's Parsha, love your neighbors yourself. That sounds like a good idea. How do you implement it? What are the practical parts of that commandment? Or my favorite, honor your parents, all right, from the 10 Commandments. Now, I don't mean to pick too much on halacha, but there are two, as far as I know, two formal requirements that you have to do to honor your parents. One is, if they're in your house, you have to feed them. All right, so if you're having dinner with your parents, you should say, can I get you something to eat? Can I bring you a glass of water? Can I bring you a glass of tea? That's one. The second is, don't sit in your parents' chair. Got to ask permission. Well, those are both nice things. I think it's nice to ask your parents if it's okay to sit in their chair. It's a sign of respect. It's nice to bring them food. They brought you a little bit of food when you were younger. You've forgotten about it mostly and had no idea how hard it is till you become a parent. That's it. When your parents call and you look on your cell phone and you see it's the caller ID is your mom or your dad, how often you just let it ring and go, I'll call them back later. Like, wouldn't it be nice maybe to have a rule like pork or a rule like tefillin or lighting candles or keeping Shabbat where you said, oh, that's an obligation. I have to deal with that. It's not written that way. We don't generally think of that. Now, I'm sure in the Rambam and elsewhere, there are ways to specify in more detail, but just think about how much time people spend on making sure they don't eat anything treif and how much time they spend on making sure they honor their parents correctly. One of those is loose, vague, and indeterminate. And we tend to go, yeah, I'm in the ballpark. The other one we go, oh, accurate, precise, and indispensable. I'm on it. So I think as human beings, it's very tempting to over focus on the laws that are precise, accurate, and indispensable and give short shrift if we're not careful to the laws that are loose, vague, and indeterminate. The Ramban, Nachmanides, has a great line in his commentary on the Chumash where he says, you can be a glutton with the permission of the Torah. So you can keep kosher, but you can act like an animal, because even though it says be holy, and it, you know, eating like an animal isn't holy, it's kind of hard to remember that when you're at the kiddush or at the buffet at the wedding, and you know the food comes out and people are like fighting over it. It's like, not so Jewish, right? But it's kosher. So when people are elbowing other people aside, it's kosher food, so it's okay. I just think it's a really good thing to keep in mind, the challenges of keeping the laws that are loose, vague, and indeterminate. And it's a challenge. I think being aware of that challenge is a good thing. I'm now going to shift gears, and we're about halfway through. So I'm going to talk for another 15 minutes about my favorite part of the theory of moral sentiments and give you the Jewish twist on it. And I'm sure I see Elon nodding. He doesn't know what I'm going to talk about. I've told him nothing. This could be about the Red Sox, Elon, but it's not. It's about Adam Smith. And he probably has, anybody who listens to Econ Talk probably has an idea what I'm going to talk about. So I think Elon has a thought here. So early on, very early on in the it's really the first page of the theory of moral sentiments, Smith asks a very simple question implicitly. He says, human beings are self-interested. They're not selfish, although we do occasionally act selfishly. But Smith's vision of human behavior is not selfish. It's self-interested. We tend to put ourselves first, and it's part of our nature, very human. Then he asks, though, if we're self-interested, why do we ever do anything else for someone else? And you think about that for a minute. It sounds like a rhetorical, silly question. It's actually quite a deep question, right? So if you think back of your last month of hanging around under this horrible virus, you might have done a kind thing or two. You might have called somebody who you knew was alone. You might have offered to go on a walk with somebody who at 6 feet distance and wearing a mask, I hope, but gone on a walk with somebody you thought might be lonely. You might have even done that with somebody whose company you don't like so much because you thought it was the right thing to do, right? So Smith asks, why do we do anything like that? Like, why is Chabad in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, instead of near the mothership in Crown Heights? I mean, that's like, what are you doing here? I mean, that's a big sacrifice. And what's the motivation there? And you should think about that for yourself. Well, why do you ever give blood? Why do you ever visit a friend in the hospital? A horrible place, the hospital. You hate them. I hate them. But you're supposed to. So we go, right? Sometimes. But why do we do that? And why do people do it? A lot of people do it who aren't religious, who are religious. Why do we do kind things? Why do we do empathetic things? Why do we listen to people who we don't want to? Why do we take that call sometimes from our parents that we don't want to take? But we take it, I hope. So one answer is that we're good at heart. We have a good soul. We're kind. Smith didn't accept that answer. He said benevolence is a weak reed to lean on when it comes to why people do good deeds. And he gives this really extraordinary example, which I'll share with you, which is very provocative. He says, suppose, the way he tells it, remember this is 1759, he says, suppose there's an earthquake in China. In his version, it swallows up the entire country. It's like the greatest rebellion of Korach story of all time. It's absurd. And for him, we have to remember, 1759, China's like Mars, right? No CNN, right? No newspapers. China's something way far away. It's just, it's a 6-week, maybe more journey by sea, far away. He says, suppose there's an earthquake there and a few 100 million people die. Because how would you react to that? Well, he said, you'd feel a moment of sadness. I'm going to put it in modern context because I think it's still true, even though you see it on CNN. When there was a tsunami that took thousands of lives in Asia a few years back, you'd watch it on TV. You'd feel horrible. You might make a donation to the Red Cross or some other charity. When you go to bed at night, you turn to your wife and say, "Boy, that earthquake in China, that tsunami, and that was horrible." Yeah, she'd say, "You'd agree," and you go to bed. You sleep like a baby. In fact, he says, you might wonder about if you had a business that had a factory in China, you might worry about whether it was going to get disrupted. Just like this coronavirus. If there was only a coronavirus in China, it never came here. Say, oh, that's tough. 4,000 people dead in Wuhan. Oh, well, you wouldn't say, oh, well, you'd say, oh, that's so sad. You're going about your life. You need to sleep well at night. Smith says, but suppose I told you that tomorrow you got to have your little finger amputated. Oh, good grief. That's a horrible thing. He said, you won't sleep. You'll be up all night. You'll be tossing and turning. So he says, how is it? So which is worse? Think about this horrible moral calculus that Smith's setting up. Which is worse? 100 million dead, losing your little finger. Smith says, if we're honest with ourselves, the loss of our finger actually is much more vivid and present, and we're more aware of it, and we're much more afraid of it than those deaths. So a lot of people end that story there, and they say Smith's a horrible person. He thinks you don't care about your little finger, and you care more about your little finger than 100 million people dead. But that's not Smith's point, because he goes on. He says, okay, you obviously, the fact that you don't sleep at night when you're going to lose your little finger, but you sleep fine when there's 100 million people dead in China, that tells us a lot about you. Whether you like it or not, whether you want to confront it or not, it tells you which you care about more. So he said, if you had a chance to save your little finger by killing a few 100 million people, would you do it? Well, most of us, I hope, would say no. In fact, Smith says it's a horrifying thought. It's a monstrous thought. No one would do that. No one's that wicked. No one's that evil, even though they've already told us how they feel about it. They care more about one than the other, but they still wouldn't do that. He says, why not? Why wouldn't they do it? So he says, if I asked you, why not? You might say, well, my parents raised me in a certain way. I have a conscience. You might say I'm compassionate. That would just be wrong. But Smith, interestingly, gives a very different answer. Smith says, and this is his answer for all of our moral dilemmas. He says, when we try to decide what the right thing to do is, we imagine an impartial spectator standing over our shoulder, looking at our behavior, an impartial spectator, not us, not self-interested me, who strangely enough always finds a way to justify what I do, certainly before the fact, and sometimes even after. But this impartial spectator is going to say, by what right would you kill people to save your little finger? And we realize that, and we shrink back from pursuing our narrowest self-interest that would come at the expense of others. He says, we don't put ourselves first. We want to, but by living in a society with other people, that tempers and reduces our self-centeredness. He says, if we put ourselves first, we're going to be really lonely. He says, we need others around us. So Smith's motivation, Smith's understanding of human activity and human behavior and happiness is summed up in a single sentence that haunts me. He says, man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. I'll say it again. Man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. Of course, Smith's writing in 1759, so he says man, but he means people, human beings. That we as human beings, we want to be loved. And by loved, he didn't just mean romantic love. He meant we want to be respected, honored, praised. That's built, hardwired into us, right? Smith's writing long before Darwin, doesn't know anything about evolution, and talks often about what he calls the author of nature, meaning God. So he's saying God put that in us, this desire for the respect and affection and honor that we get from other people. We want to matter. We want to be important. We want to be honored, respected, and praised. But more than that, we don't just want to be loved. We want to be lovely. We want to be worthy of honor, worthy of praise, worthy of respect, which is incredible. He says, there's two ways to be loved. The first is the glittering path, he calls it. Pursue power, fame, and wealth. He says, those are the people who get all the attention. Everybody wants to know what they care about, what their thoughts are. Athletes, entertainers, actors, actresses, singers, politicians, the rich, famous, and powerful. That's who we write about. When they walk into the room, our eyes turn to them. When I give this talk in front of a group, I always say, imagine we're sitting in a lecture hall, you guys are listening to me, and Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt walk in. because they've always wanted to know what Adam Smith had to say about Judaism. So they're sitting off to the side. Would you look at me? Not for a minute. I wouldn't look at me. I'd be looking at them too. We'd all want to just look at them. Now, forget what they have to say. But if they talk, we're going to hang on every word. But forget that. We just want to look at them. They're special. So he says that feeling, he says, when a poor person goes through the world, no one pays any attention to them. So that's why it's so corrosive and depressing and undignified to be poor. It's not so much that you don't have stuff. It's that people don't pay attention to you. It's a terrible thing, right? I always use this example. It comes up on Econ Talk now and then. We talk about when I try to see someone on the street who's asking for money, I try to give them money, but more than that, I try a little bit. It's hard to do, but to give them a little bit of attention. Say hello to them. Ask them how their day's going. Look at them in the eye when you give them $1. Don't just ignore them. Don't pretend they don't exist. It's a terrifying and terrible thing to do to another human being created in the image of God. It's a horrible thing. So we care. We want to be observed. We want to be noticed. We want to matter. So Smith says there's 2 ways to get it. The first, we just said, wealth, fame, and power. We know that. Said the second way is a little less seductive. It's to be wise and virtuous. That also gets you good press, right? If you're wise and virtuous, people pay attention to you. They're nice to you. They like you. Oh, that's the guy that gave that. Yeah, oh, he's wonderful. Or she did that thing for the. So that works too. But he says, that's a hard path. That's quiet. No one really makes a big deal out of that path. But he says, that's the path you ought to be on. And the other way he says it, by the way, he says, the chief part of human happiness arises from the consciousness of being beloved. The chief part of human happiness arises from the consciousness of being beloved. Beautiful idea. And I think very accurate. I think a very powerful way to think about what motivates us as human beings. And I see some people are starting to fill up the chat. I'm going to look at it in a minute. I'm almost done. And then we'll turn to your questions. So Smith, his argument for why we're decent to the people around us, and sometimes more than decent, why we're giving and loving and kind, it's part of it's in our nature, but it's not a very strong part of our nature in Smith's view. A lot of it comes from our desire to earn the respect of the people around us. And it's kind of incredible, because I'm pretty sure Smith never read the Talmud, but about 17 centuries before Smith, 1700, 1800 years before Smith, a great Jewish sage, Yochanan ben Zakkai, had a very similar observation about what motivates us. It's in the Talmud, it's in Brachot, page 28b. So he's dying. Yochanan ben Zakkai is on his deathbed. And his students come to him and they say, Rabbi, give us a blessing, or teacher, give us a blessing. And he says to them, so listen to this blessing. It's a very peculiar blessing. He says, may it be God's will that the fear of heaven shall be upon you like the fear of flesh and blood. That's his blessing. Doesn't make any sense. Let me try to paraphrase it. He's saying his blessing for his students is that they should be as afraid of God as they are of their fellow human beings, flesh and blood. So they're puzzled. The students get like, what kind of a blessing is that? It's like a weird, paradoxical, warped blessing. They said to that point and not beyond, meaning you wouldn't give us a blessing to have the fear of heaven and be like past what it is with our fear of God. Shouldn't it be much bigger than our fear of human beings? And he said to them, oh boy, hey, says Yochanan ben Zakkai, if you could only fear that much, he says Yochanan ben Zakkai, know that when one commits a transgression, he says to himself, I hope nobody sees me. If one is concerned about avoiding shame before God, as he is before man, he will never sin. So it's this weird, flipped morality that Yochanan ben Zakkai is blessing his students with. You should be as afraid of God as you are of human beings. In other words, you worry much more about your reputation with your neighbor and your buddies in shul than you worry about what God thinks about you. Because we know you pay attention to that. If somebody sees you eating in a non-kosher restaurant, you're going to hide. One of your buddies sees you. If somebody sees you doing something you're not supposed to do Jewishly, you know you're going to be embarrassed. He says, but why is it that you aren't embarrassed in front of God doing those things? And he says, because you're not. It's much easier to be afraid of actual flesh and blood than God, who's provides the space. So I want to close with this, that one way to think about Ben Zakkai's blessing is that we should strive to be in the presence of the divine in the same way we sense the judgment of our friends and family. And if we can reach that level, we'll all, I think, lead a better life. So I'm going to stop there. And I want to take questions. I want to see what people have written here in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me so I will, for you, Russ, I'll read these questions, but I just have two that I wanted to start with.
Yeah, sure.
Off the cuff. So your one has to do with Mandeville's parable and
Yeah.
what you think Smith would, can you speak to how that would be approached through a Smithian lens? And the second is the Hume, they were very good friends, Smith and Hume, and Hume, was on his deathbed and said, all I need is the works of my good friend Smith. But what would Smith, and what does Smith have to say about the Mandevillian parable of the bees, and what does Smith have to say about Hume's very poignant argument that our passions whip our desires, that our passions are the thing that really control our reason. So we do something and then
Yeah.
we concoct justifications later. And then I will read these questions as they
Yeah.
come in.
Yeah. So Hume understood, and I think he was right, again, long before neuroscience, long before modern psychology, Hume understood that we're really good at justifying our behavior ex post, after the fact, and explain why it was the right thing to do, why it was kind, why it was, appropriate, et cetera, rather than it was what I wanted to do. And Smith understood that as well. Even, Smith says man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. But he also writes that, we tend to like to think of ourselves as lovely even when we're not. And we're prone to self-deception, and we're prone to justifying our actions. And he talks about it explicitly. He says, in the heat of the moment, that impartial spectator is gone. You're not thinking about that person at all in moments of, gluttony and passion. He says, or impulsive behavior. He says later you might start to realize, oh yeah, that was kind of the wrong thing to do, and you might have regrets. So Smith understands that this system of what I would call a decentralized morality rather than legislation to keep people in line, right? Smith's view of civilization is that we keep each other in line through this judgment, right? Our desire to be loved and lovely encourages people to behave well because they don't want to be judged by their neighbor. They want to be judged positively. So you do good deeds to earn the approval of the people around you, and you avoid bad deeds to avoid their censure. And, Smith says that's basically what creates civilization. But he's not an idiot. He understands it often doesn't work. People do horrible things. They're selfish. My favorite example is you find a wallet in the street with money in it, and no one's looking. Sometimes you take the money, right? It's the wrong thing to do. We understand it's wrong. But we also understand that if more people are looking, it's more likely you won't keep the money. Wish it were otherwise, but that's human nature. I think Smith would understand. So I think Smith was very much consistent with Hume's view that the passions are what really motivate us, not rationality and reason. And in fact, this whole idea that we concoct reasons for what we do ex post, after the fact, is really the way human beings actually typically behave. And I think that's a deep insight and true. So Mandeville and the bees. So Mandeville said, people act selfishly and good things come of it, which is embedded in Smith's idea of the invisible hand. We had another half hour, we talk about the invisible hand, which is a complicated idea, but and not, I think, well understood by, I think the invisible hand is very well understood by modern economists. They don't understand what Smith actually meant by it. It's come to mean something that Smith didn't actually intend. But Mandeville was basically saying, people are totally selfish and wicked and baseless and not nice, and yet the world turns out pretty well. That's sort of I'm parroting and caricaturing it, but that's sort of Mandeville's view of how the world works. And Smith hated that. He liked part of it, which is what we tend to think of as the invisible hand, that when people act in their own self-interest, other things happen that aren't as bad as, let me give you my favorite way of thinking about it. The desire for profit, if there's competition, the way you make profit is by treating your customers well. If you have a monopoly, you can exploit them. But if you don't have a monopoly, the way you thrive in a modern free market system is by doing a better job than your competitors at making them happy. To quote my former colleague, Walter Williams, he says, here's my relationship with my grocery store. I don't tell them when I'm going to show up. I don't tell them what I'm going to buy, and I don't tell them how much I'm going to buy. But if I show up and they don't have it, I fire them. Now, we live in a time right now where that's not true because a lot of places don't have toilet paper. Why not is a long story. It's not so long, actually. It's considered socially and sometimes legally inappropriate to raise the price of toilet paper. If they'd raised the price of toilet paper, there would have been plenty on the shelves, and there'd be an incentive for more people to be making it, and that price wouldn't stay high for long, et cetera, et cetera. But my point is that in normal times, groceries work like crazy, not to figure out ways to exploit me, but to figure out ways to do better than the other groceries so that I'll show up there rather than at their competitor. And that's the idea of how competition and self-interest, this desire for profit, can serve humanity. And similarly, if I want to be an effective person in business, I have to put myself in my customer's shoes to give them what they want. I have to be empathetic in some degree. So Smith believed that commercial life was good for us. It made us better people. Mandeville didn't think that. Mandeville thought we're all just wicked. We went around, we're greedy. And Smith just rebelled against that. And a lot of what the theory of moral sentiments is his attempt to say, that's a terrible vision of humanity, and it's not accurate. There is a good side to us. We do care about other people, somewhat naturally, but mostly because we want to be part of this larger culture and civilization and society. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Let's get on to the first question. So Brent asked if every law was so black and white, and he might be conveying your earlier conversation about Judaism.
For sure.
Wouldn't it preclude free agency?
Well, it would make it a lot clearer, right? So I'll give you an example. I was at a conference once with someone who had stomach cancer, and because he'd had stomach cancer, he couldn't eat meat. It made him violently ill. He still liked meat, but it made him sick. I was at the conference. I keep kosher, and I wanted to eat the steak also, but it wasn't good for me spiritually. But whether it was or not, I just keep kosher, so I wasn't going to eat the steak either. So God could have made kosher such that if a Jew ate non-kosher food or ate pork, lightning would strike him and they'd be killed. That would make it easy, right? That's the ultimate black and white, where the consequences are clear. There's no long-term worries. It's all short-term, and you know what's right and wrong, and everything just is a piece of cake. But the world doesn't work that way, or at least after, there's some of that in the time when we were wandering the desert for 40 years, right? There were pretty clear punishments about right and wrong, but we live in a world today where if you eat non-kosher food or pork, nothing happens to you. You don't get hit by lightning. You're fine. You don't get sick like my buddy did. And I think that's part of what gives us free will, Brent. I don't think we all understand we all sin. All of us break Jewish law from time to time, whether we want to or not. Even if we have good intentions, we're often, except for the rabbi and his wife, I'm sure they don't ever sin. But their idea of a sin is so inferior to mine. It's like, oi, mincha, I'm late. 10 minutes late for mincha. Shame on him. Shame on you, Rabbi. But anyway, we all have challenges. It's humor. Sorry, Rabbi. We all have humor. We all have temptation, and we all have imperfection, and we all have flaws. And the distinction I'm trying to make is that some of those, even when we have good intentions, the laws of Judaism are not black and white, are hard to keep well. And I encourage all of us to think about how to keep those laws better. I'll give you another example. Actually, I once davened on a Shabbat morning, and I didn't have kavanah. I didn't have any intention. I just said the words, and while I was davening, I was thinking about the Red Sox and what my kids were doing and what we're going to have for lunch, and I could smell the kiddush. And so that happened to me once, but I hear it happens to other people, like every time, like me, really, actually, almost it's hard to pay attention. So prayer is supposed to be the service of the heart. How often do we do that? Well, one of the reasons it's hard to do is that, I don't know about you, but when I pray, I sometimes kind of race into it and get it over with. I can check the box. I got it done. Hey, I davened, I prayed. It's not a good idea, not appropriate, right? Even a tiny, tiny, tiny pause before stepping 3 steps back for your Amidah, your Shemona Esrei would be life-changing in theory, right? I don't know about you, but I struggle to do that. Confession, right? It's hard to do. Hard to think about what you're doing. It's easy to let your mind wander. I said the words, I'm good, you know, magic. But I think there are a lot of aspects of Judaism that if we're not careful, they become like that. And it becomes by rote and it loses its, you know, sweetness. So,
Okay.
next question.
Yeah. So Andy says, Smith never seemed to have fallen into the tempting fallacy of some modern economists, that economics is a hard science. He had a keen appreciation of the broad scope of human nature, and that important parts of it are just not quantifiable or predictable. So what are your thoughts on this, Professor Roberts?
Yeah, so Smith gets called the first economist. He's really the first social scientist. He writes about everything. He writes about what we'd call sociology, as you've taught earlier tonight, what we would call psychology, philosophy, history. He's interested in how the world works in all of its dimensions. So he's curious about all that stuff. And he's writing in 1759, doesn't have any math to speak of. He knows some math actually, but doesn't put in his books. He's he writes what I would call narrative economics, storytelling. He gathers facts about the world, tries to weave them together to explain to the reader how something works. It's phenomenal stuff. It's great. It's imperfect. He knows it. You know, there's a famous story of a pin factory as an example of how specialization increases wealth. I think he never went to a pin factory. He kind of just made it up. You know, it made sense to him, so he told the story. So it's a good story, right? If you read it, and you can find it at the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, you'll find out that, wow, that's an interesting part of why people have a higher standard of living than they used to have in the past. There's more specialization, more trade. That's good. But he didn't have a mathematical equation of it, and he just told a story about a pin factory that seemed to him consistent logically with how the world worked. So modern economics tends to focus on the measurable, which I think is a terrible mistake. We can see that right now, if I can become timely and a little bit controversial. You know, this debate about whether we should reopen end the lockdown to, quote, save the economy. What a horrible idea. Why would you want to end the lockdown to save the economy? Stupid. You do want to think about ending the lockdown to save the dignity of the millions of people who aren't able to provide for themselves and their family, and who are worried about their future, and whose children aren't getting any education. That's worth thinking about. I wouldn't say automatic that we should then open the economy or open up from the lockdown, but it's certainly not about just the fact, you know, when I hear economists argue about it, they say, yeah, it's true, the economy isn't worth saving, but if we don't save the economy, there'll be more deaths because there'll be more suicides because we'll be depressed. As if that's the only thing that's negative about millions of people being out of work and having no dignity and struggling with their marriages and their kids not respecting them and their kids not learning anything. They already have a horrible school. Now they're going to learn another 6 months. Are going to go by with learning zero. So all those things matter to me, but a lot of them aren't measured. Say somebody was on Twitter today. Somebody said, well, how would you measure dignity? Or what do you mean by dignity? Like, oh, like it's a made up thing because I can't, oh, my dignity, you know, before the virus, my dignity was at an 8.3, but now it's at a 7.6. So I'm worried about it. It's going down. Like, the fact that you can't quantify it doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to it. Okay, next question.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so Era says, would this be similar to progression of Jobs tests?
Jobs.
Job's test. He first loses all of his belongings, then his children, and ultimately in his greatest test, a case of boils.
Yeah.
So yeah, thoughts on this?
Yeah, so Job, it's an interesting question. I never thought about that. I assume that's a reference to my point about losing your little finger and what's really maybe the range of human emotions and response to stuff. And by the way, I should mention my email is russroberts@gmail.com. So if you have other things you want to talk about or reactions, just feel free to drop me an email, russroberts@gmail. It's interesting. You know, I think a lot about, it's a horrible thing to say. I think a lot about Job. Boy, that's, Right, something's wrong with that guy. Who spends a lot of time thinking about Job? But I think a modern person, a human being who wants to have a serious relationship with Judaism has to deal with the reality that there are parts of human experience that seem inexplicable. I like the Jewish approach to suffering. It's that we're agnostic. We don't know why God has certain things in store for us and other people. And I find many attempts to justify those things pretty offensive. I just read a book called Faith After the Holocaust by Eliezer Berkovitz. Anybody here ever heard of Eliezer Berkovitz? Not well known. He wrote a wonderful book called God, Man, and History, which I strongly recommend. In his book, Faith After the Holocaust, it's an incredible book. And he talks a lot about Job, and I've forgotten what he says about him, so I'm not going to try to bring it in. But it's an interesting observation about Job, and I'd have to think about it some more. It is fascinating that his own personal physical discomfort is kind of like the last straw. Great point.
Okay, Leon. He says, firstly, a compliment. The Keynes and Hayek raps made you an eternal legend. His question.
Thank you, Leon. Kind of you.
Friedrich Bastiat wrote, quote, that which is seen and that which is not seen in 1848. These basic rules of logic, debunking of fallacies and instructions of basically analyzing economic decisions have existed for over 150 years. So why in 2020, especially clear in the response to the virus, do I still read articles from supposed economists and hear speeches from esteemed politicians who either peddle economic fallacies or are unaware of the unseen consequences of their decisions? Why do they still make these consequential yet simple mistakes?
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of the fundamental ideas of economics are old. They're not secrets. I just wrote a piece on why price gouging is good. And that if we had allowed prices to rise, we wouldn't have had the shortage of masks that we had, which is horrible. I think we would have saved lives, literally saved lives, if we'd let people make more masks and make more money making those masks. And people look at me like I'm a heartless, evil person because I think that's a good idea. Oh, how dare you make some people pay more for masks than they're paying now? That's horrible. It's exploitive. And so people say, why don't politicians understand this? And I say, well, they do, maybe, but the voters don't. So they tend to listen to the voters more or less, not always, but more or less. And so they do tend, the level of economic education is low. And I want to say before I go further that I don't want to suggest I'm right for sure. I might not be right, but it's interesting. People don't even take my view they kind of don't even consider it. It's like, what are you talking about? Price gouging is horrible. Making bright people make more for something they desperately need. How dare you introduce money and profits? It's like, do you think doctors should get paid? Well, of course. You mean they're allowed to profit off of other people's illness? Oh yeah, I guess that is kind of the same thing. But okay, put that to the side. That's just a cheap shot. Thought I'd throw that in for you, Leon. But the more fundamental question is that there are many, many things I think deep inside us that are troubled by what I would call economic reasoning, right? So our desire for community. So if when we only have, let's say, one cookie available for dessert, I don't auction it off to the highest bidder in the family. I don't use prices. That's cruel, it's stupid, it's disgusting. So Hayek pointed this out a long time ago, 1989, I think. Hayek said, you really have to have two sets of ways of looking at the world. In your family, you're a socialist, right? You should be. I always give this example that when my kids would trade baseball cards, one of the older son would be really good at it. He could really take advantage of his younger brothers because they knew who the good players were. So he'd trade and take advantage of them. And I said, look, I'm the commissioner. I have to approve all trades. So I vetoed a ton of trades. It's not laissez-faire in the Roberts household. It's highly regulated. But I don't think that should be the system that works outside the household, because the reason it works well in the household is there's love. That's important, one. And two, there's a lot of information that I have about my children. I don't think Donald Trump loves me, and I don't think he understands much about my situation. And that would be true of the other 535 members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. And I kind of don't, it doesn't mean I'm an anarchist. There are a lot of things that the government should do, has to do, and do well. But my point is that the recognition of the limits of centralized decision-making are in conflict often with the way I come out of the womb. I come out of the womb into a family, and then I go out into the world at the age of 18 or 22 or 26, whatever it is. And I got a whole different mindset. And some people keep that mindset their whole life and hope to find that family connection in a bigger setting with 330 million other family members. Now, that sounds ridiculous. I think it is ridiculous, but I think it's also true. And I think it's more than that. I think it's dangerous. I think the way you make the world a better place is not by running other people's lives, but by making yourself better, mostly. There are exceptions to that, obviously. But mostly, if you want to make the world a better place, start with yourself, is my view. I'm really bad at it, by the way. I'm struggling. I do the best I can, but the idea that I can run other people's lives better than I can is really a stretch for me. So, but having said that, if you go to Israel, it's a very different setting for how people relate to their government and their neighbors and strangers there. Very different. It's much more like a family. I was talking to some students the other day. They were hitchhiking in Israel, and they got on a road they shouldn't have been on, and it's 3 a.m. The buses stopped running, and they're lost, and they're really scared. And a car pulls up, and they beg this guy for a ride, and he takes them. He said, "Well, I'm not going where you're going." He says, "Well, they said, can you take us home?" So this Israeli took these 3 yeshiva students from America and let them sleep in his house. Oh my gosh, can you imagine? In America, you're hitchhiking at you're driving at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. You came across a bunch of strangers, and they say, "Can we come to your house?" It's like, I mean, it's absurd. Israel, it's like no big deal. Israel does things like that happen all the time. So like, Israel, we talk a lot about how Israel has all these divisions and they don't get along. In a crisis, they're pretty good at it. My niece lives in Israel. When she went back there recently, she had to be quarantined for 14 days. She was quarantined in her room, not her house, her room. How did they do that? Well, her cell phone was the test of whether she was quarantined effectively or not. So in theory, I think she could go outside or go into the other rooms of the house, but leave her if she left her phone, right? But the government actually monitored whether she was staying in her room or not, or at least her phone was. Can you imagine that in America? We'd go crazy, and rightfully so. It would be a terrifying thing if the government could tell me when I had to stay in my room. It would really upset me. And Israel, it's like, oh yeah, well, whatever. It's good for the country. So it's a very different thing. I think it's imaginable to live in a society that's larger than a family that has some connections, but I think not so easy in America. Very heterogeneous, by the way, which is a beautiful thing, but challenging for certain political outcomes as a result. And so I think after I've rambled on and not answered your question, Leon, what I'm trying to say is that, our fundamental way of looking at the world, which comes a lot from the way we're raised and born. I don't mean raised by our parents' attitudes, but by the fact that we grew up in a family, gives us a certain set of what we think are desirable ways that the world should run. We're not used to being in a large decentralized economy with 330 million people, it's amazing it works at all. It works pretty well. But it's not surprising to me that we struggle to sometimes think like economists. And there are times I don't want us to, actually, to be honest. But masks isn't one of those times. Actually, I think we should have let the prices rise. But anyway, any other questions? Comments?
Yeah, let's open it up to anybody that wants to unmute yourself and maybe throw on some video. If you don't want to throw on the video, that's fine. But if you have a question, please just ask. And I do want to just comment really quickly that the growing, you're starting with your own garden. That's an idea that Rabbi Zalman and I have talked about coming from the Rebbe, where you initially you have to start with the plants. This grows into the garden, and you can't go over to your neighbor's garden if your garden isn't looking so hot. And so, yeah, it's a beautiful idea, and I extend. Please ask any question. Just unmute yourself.
The idea of there's an enormous temptation to work on other people's gardens other than your own. It's kind of like we often find it easy to criticize the religious behavior of other people, right, rather than our own. Our own, of course. Well, I have the excuse. I had to do that. I couldn't help myself. Whatever. Other people go like, "Whoa, did you see that person do that?" So it's better to fix your own garden first. Generally, good advice. Any other questions, comments?
Anyone who has questions, just open up your mic
Yeah.
and begin asking.
I have a quick question. Thank you, Dr. Roberts. That was very interesting. I'm Rav Ben David, and I'm actually from Laramie, Wyoming, not Jackson. So hi, everybody. It's good to meet you. My question relates to the, my question relates to the incredible income gap, or the wealth gap that we have developed in modern societies. And that includes Israel as well as the United States and many Western countries. How can we continue on this path with such a huge gap that leaves a lot of people very, very vulnerable?
So I'm a passionate advocate for worrying less about the gap and worrying more about the people at the bottom. So in China, according to the data, which are flawed beyond imagining, no doubt, but let's just take the data as fact for a moment. In China, they've had a massive increase in inequality and a massive increase in the well-being of the people at the bottom. And I think that was a good thing. I wouldn't say I have nothing really to say about the precision of whether that's a great thing or a pretty good thing, but what I like is that the people at the bottom grew a lot. And they were people who were near subsistence, of course. They were living in very low levels of income. So I think that's great. In the United States, it is widely believed that we have increased the top, and the bottom and the middle have stayed stagnant for the last 40 years. I think that's a fundamental misreading of the data. I've made a bunch of videos about it. I wrote a long essay called Do the Rich Get All the Gains from Economic Growth? Send me an email, I'll send you a link to it. You can see what you think of it. But let's put that to the side. Let's pretend I'm wrong. Let's pretend that the standard view is correct, that the middle and the bottom haven't gained very much over the last 40 years. That's the terrible thing. To me, it's not so much the fact that some people have gotten further ahead. So here's what's true. What's true is that the richest people today are much richer than the richest people of yesterday, meaning 40 years ago. I use the basketball example. Steph Curry makes a lot more than the person in the stands at a Golden State Warriors game than Larry Bird or Magic Johnson did relative to people in the stands in the 1980s. It's been a big growth in the people at the top's compensation. If you're the best actor in the world, you make a lot more than you used to. The reason is that the audiences are bigger, right? If you're a great basketball player today, you're making people, entertaining people in China, not just in your hometown, not just in the United States. If you're an entertainer, if you're a singer, you're singing to 7 billion customers, not just the 100 million here in the United States. So that's why they make more money. And that doesn't bother me. I think that's okay. I'm okay with that. I like the incentive to become successful. But I'm much more worried, Rob, about the people at the bottom. And even though I think I'm right that the people at the bottom on average have done well, there's a significant portion of people in the United States who are being, quote, left behind. And those are the people I want to focus on. I want to spend less time worrying about the size of the gap between the people at the bottom and the top and focusing on the actual situation of the people at the bottom. In fact, one of the examples of this came up the other day. People said, there was a headline description of an article in The Economist that said, this crisis is going to deepen inequality even more. Yes, it is, probably. But that's not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about what it's doing to the people at the bottom, the people who lost their jobs, people who, like I mentioned before, whose kids aren't getting educated. My kids are still going to college through Zoom. My wife is still teaching her students in a private high school via Zoom. She meets with them every day. In public schools, in a lot of public schools, tragically, they're not meeting at all because it's unfair, because some people don't have access to broadband or access to Zoom or access to a laptop. That's the tragedy that I'm worried about and upset about. I'm worried about a wonderful book by Chris Arnade, a former Wall Street trader, wrote a book called Dignity. He dropped out of finance and wandered around the country taking pictures of drug dealers and people struggling on the street, and homeless people. It's an incredible book. And those are the folks who we ought to be worrying about, the people who are tragically are lonely, don't have a purpose in life, feel forgotten, aren't loved or lovely in their own eyes, and are taking opioids and can't find work and can't find a spouse. That's a huge problem in America today. So I know, Rob, I'm sure you're also upset about that and worried about those people but I think it's important to frame it correctly. And I think it's really important that we think about ways to help those folks and not so worried. I understand there's a natural tendency to think that the people at the top have caused the misery at the bottom. I don't think that's the case. It's possible that we could help people at the bottom using the resources of the people at the top. There's an argument to be made for redistribution. I'm not sure it's a good argument. It's not my first thought. My first thought is, how can I help the children in those school systems that have horrible experiences have a better one? I've just done 3 interviews on this recently on my podcast, talking to different people looking at charter schools. And some people think charter schools are a wonderful solution. Some people think they're wicked and horrible and don't help people. So I think these are the questions I want to be talking about, and how we can help the people in those bad situations more than we're helping them now. And to be blunt, what we really ought to be doing is finding ways to help them help themselves rather than figuring out what we need to do for them in our eyes. So it's a complicated, terribly challenging social situation.
So I agree with you fully, except for the fact that a lot of these, what we call successful and rich people, are actually made their fortune by cheating the system. If they get subsidies, if they can declare bankruptcy and at the same time walk with $14 million bonuses, that is wrong. So that's not a success story.
No, I agree. We should fix that. 100% agree with you. We should fix that too, obviously. We should stop subsidizing Wall Street, which we do through bailouts, which we did in 2008. It's a horrible thing, I think, to help. By the way, people who don't like Trump, they forget, unfortunately, that part of the reason that Donald Trump is president of the United States is because the policy elites made sure that the richest people in the history of the world, people on Wall Street, a lot of them paid no price for the financial crisis and the decisions they made. And that's disgusting. But as if you think populism in America today is dangerous, wait to see what we get after this virus. I'm very worried about the impact of the virus on the people who are going to be, so I work from home. I worked from home before the crisis. Now I still work from home. I do have to share my broadband with my 2 sons who are home from college and my wife. It's a terrible, I'm just having a tough time here. But that's my level of suffering. I've got nothing to complain about, nothing. The people who have stuff to complain about are the baristas and the waiters and the cab drivers and the Uber drivers and the people who were scraping by, doing okay, maybe working 2 jobs, tough life. Now they have nothing. And they get a check in the mail, which most of them probably didn't get. And it came late, and they're late on their rent, and their kids are wondering why there's no food on the table. And they don't respect their parents, and the parents don't respect themselves. It's just, those people are going to listen to a very angry voice in 2024. It's going to be it's dangerous. So I just hope we can get out of this. I don't want to suggest we should just open the economy because this is horrible. We have to be careful. We have to look for ways to mitigate the dangers of the virus through social distancing and masks and maybe other things. I'm 65. I need to stay home. But I don't want to tell a 30-year-old they can't make a living if they can find a way to do it that's relatively safe. And we'll find out soon. We're already doing it. It's not in my hands. So.
Thank you. So does Adam Gospel have any question?
Yeah, I have a question. A lot of the presentation, the question obviously was very America-centric. My background is in international business. I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Doesn't this essentially just prove that the world's very interconnected and we can't just focus on ourselves, and we have to look at this through more of a global and world lens? We're all in this world together, and the only way we're gonna survive is to figure out how we can all come together as a human population, and including the environment as well, in my opinion. Any thoughts, comments, or opinions on that?
Yeah, well, I wish you luck, because as much as we like to think that we're all going to come together after this challenge, I think it's going to lead to a terrible rise in nationalism, some of which is maybe not the end of the world, but a lot of it will be ugly. Our relationship with China is very complicated right now, really complicated. It's going to get worse. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So I'm a big fan of global trade. I'm a big fan of immigration. And those viewpoints are going to be increasingly unpopular, I think, in the aftermath of this crisis. And I think the natural urge that kind people have to be to look for alternatives to reduce the tensions that are in the world are going to struggle to find traction. So I think it's a great challenge to those of us who have an affection for international trade or migration from people who are trying to improve the lives of their children, which I think most migration's about, and I think it's a beautiful thing. But the public sentiment toward it's going to be very hard to sustain. And I wish I had something more cheerful. I guess I'd say this on a more cheerful side, and we should probably go. It's 10:45 here on the East Coast, which is where I am. But I feel funny saying this in front of the rabbi, but I'm going to say it anyway. So here goes. You know, in the modern era, meaning the last 100 years, and you could certainly say for the last 25 years, religion is having a very tough time. A very tough time. Religion is fundamentally about a serious religion, serious Judaism is about the challenge of, you know, any one day is not so easy, right? This, you know, when you want to watch the football game on Saturday or go to the mall and you have to keep Shabbat, it's not so fun. The payoff is intangible. It is not so obvious when you're going through it. And I'm going to make an analogy, which I don't know if anybody will like this, but it's a lot like marriage, right? Marriage is hard, but it's fantastic. Having children is hard, but it's fantastic. And any one day, your children can drive you crazy, but they're everything. They give your life meaning. Same with marriage, same with religion. So for me, religion is the richest part in my family, the richest parts of my life. But any one day, they can be challenging, right? And I think that sell, to put it in a marketing framework, which is a little bit offensive, but I think it's helpful to think of it that way sometimes. It's not selling so well, right? The last 20 years in America, forget Judaism, Christianity's taken a beating, right? People don't go to church so much anymore. Young people don't affiliate. So it's a big challenge, I think, for people who care deeply about religion to deal with this. So we're losing folks. You know, all these things I'm talking about, we're having a hard time. If you care about children, the family, marriage, religion, they don't have the cachet they once had. They don't have the upper hand. They don't have the cultural high ground. And they're struggling. So I'm still committed. That's the good news, Rabbi. It's okay. I think it's an important mission. And I think this virus, to come back to Adam's question, is going to be really interesting to see how people respond to it, right? I don't know about you. Most of you are young, and it's wonderful to have all of you on my conversation with you. But, you know, this virus forces you to think about your mortality, right? And sometimes when you think about your mortality, you start to think about things other than just the next 10 minutes. Our culture is very the next 10 minutes oriented. And I think there's a great opportunity for religion. So I think it's going to be hard, Adam, to create an international consensus around global warming, around the next pandemic. I think there's going to be, unfortunately, I think there's a natural opposite temptation, which is to say, hey, next time I'm going to make sure we get our masks, make sure the other people don't get any of them. That's the tragedy of this kind of event. It often tends to lead to a lot more inwardness. And I think the way we fight against that is through religion and through God and through Judaism, and to recognize the potential for meaning in life that comes from it, as well as the power of community, which is a glorious thing. We're getting a little taste of it tonight. It's special to be with you. I'm very grateful you're taking the time to listen to my thoughts on Adam Smith and Judaism. And these are things that I think make life worth living, right? Getting together in a shul, coming together as a Jewish community or any kind of community gives life texture, it gives life a richness it doesn't otherwise have. And I think that's where we ought to look for our chance to make the world a better place in the aftermath of this tragic situation.
Russ, do we have one more time for one more question from someone who has not yet had a chance to ask a question?
If it's an easy one, sure.
Okay, make it as hard as you can. Anyone got a hard one for us before we get going? Any last questions from anyone who hasn't yet had a chance to ask? Please unmute yourself and begin to ask your question. Otherwise, we're gonna call it a night over here. Please let me know if you have a
I
question.
have a question.
Oh,
What is an
Karen's got-
economic novel?
Oh, that's an easy question. Thank you, Karen. So I wrote 3 novels. I've written 3 novels. I don't think I'll write another one, so I've been put in the past tense. To try to help people understand different aspects of economics. The first one I wrote is called The Choice. It's David Ricardo comes back as a ghost to try to convince an American TV manufacturer in 1960 that Japanese TVs are okay for America, even though they're going to be really bad for him and his town. So that's a dialogue between them. My second book, The Invisible Heart, is about, it's really a free market manifesto. It's a little bit out on the edge, but it's about a economics teacher in a Washington, D.C. high school and an English teacher at that high school. She thinks economics is wicked and heartless, and he doesn't. So they have a lot of arguments. A lot of mansplaining in that one. I'm ashamed to say my kids gave me a hard time. It was written in 2001. And, I was flawed. But the man does a lot of explaining because he's the teacher and she's the listener. But in my next book, The Price of Everything, it's women-splaining. So I have my main character is a woman, Ruth Lieber, who's the provost at Stanford. And she's got a student of economics who she's trying to help him understand the way emergent order works and how it affects our economy. And I think that's my best book for lots of reasons. So if you're interested, check out The Price of Everything. It's a short and relatively painless read because it's written in the form of a novel. And the fiction's, it's a B-, C+. Not bad.
Great title.
Thank you. Thanks, folks. It was great talking.
Russ, very, very much. Final question, Russ, if anyone would like to be in touch with you or to support your work, how could they be in touch with you and help you in any way that we possibly can?
Well, please check out Econ Talk, where fine podcasts are sold, although there's no charge. Every Monday morning at 6:30 a.m. Eastern, 4:30 for you. Fantastic head start for you relative to the rest of the country. You get to hear it before almost anyone else, except for a few listeners in Hawaii who love it, being early. But seriously, every Monday morning, I have a conversation with someone who I think is interesting and hope you will too. Used to be mostly economists, now not so many, so that's better for people who find economics boring and tedious. My website is russroberts.info. And you can follow me on Twitter at Econ Talker, and you can write me at russroberts@gmail.com. Thanks,
Well,
folks.
thank you very, very much. Please put your hands together for Professor Dr. Russ Roberts. Thank you so much for that wonderful, insightful, meaningful presentation. We really appreciate it from the bottom of our hearts, and we look forward to inviting you out to visit us over here in person when things get a little bit less crazy.
Look
Thank
forward
you,
to
Russ,
it.
very much.
Thank you, folks. Take care.
Take care.